It started with something simple. A dusty old box in the attic, the kind of thing families forget for decades. But inside was a name, a photo, a date, and a question no one in the family had ever asked. Who was Eleanor B. Morris? A thin layer of dust blanketed everything in the attic. Old boxes, forgotten photo albums, broken holiday decorations, all stacked and silent. Rachel moved carefully, the wood creaking under her feet as she tried to make room for the last of their moving boxes. Ben's father had passed away 6 months earlier, and the house, empty for nearly a year, had a stillness that felt untouched. They'd agreed to move in temporarily, to sort through everything. But already it felt like the house had plans of its own. While clearing a narrow corner behind an old wardrobe, Rachel noticed a box she hadn't seen earlier. It was wedged behind, a trunk pushed deep into the shadows. Unlike the others, this one wasn't labeled. Its surface was worn smooth from time, but on top, faint lettering was just visible in pencil. Do not destroy. Her curiosity got the better of her. The box wasn't locked, just taped shut with a yellowed strip of brittle adhesive. Inside were dozens of folded papers, newspaper clippings, photographs, and something soft wrapped in clear plastic. She set the box down and began carefully examining the contents. One of the first things she unfolded was a local newspaper dated May 1958. The headline read, "Eleanor Morris, age 6, vanishes without a trace." The article described a young girl who went missing from her front yard just weeks after her family had moved into the neighborhood. There were no witnesses, no clear leads. The child had been wearing a blue dress with white trim. Below the article was a black and white photo, Eleanor's school portrait. Rachel paused. There was something strangely familiar about the image. She set it aside and pulled out the plastic-wrapped fabric. Inside was a faded child's dress, small and delicate, still holding faint hints of blue. It was the same style mentioned in the article. Rachel's heart raced. She turned over the dress and noticed a tiny embroidered name on the inside of the collar. Ellie. She sat in silence, the attic suddenly too quiet. At the bottom of the box were more articles, all from 1958 to 1960, tracing the brief, failed efforts to find Eleanor. Another headline mentioned that the family had moved out just a year after the disappearance. There were no updates after that. No follow-up, no arrest, no resolution. But what shocked Rachel most was a copy of a police incident report, yellowed and folded in half. The address listed under last known location was the same as the house she was standing in. Her house. Their house. The floor beneath her seemed to shift. This wasn't just a box of forgotten things. This was a sealed piece of someone's life, someone's silence. She picked up the photo again and looked at the girl's eyes, large, dark, cautious. Had she once played in the same front yard where Ben had grown up? Sat at the same kitchen table? Rachel called down to Ben, her voice breaking the hush of the attic. Whatever this was, it wasn't forgotten anymore. Eleanor Morris had once lived in the very house where Rachel and Ben now walked and unpacked and made coffee without knowing. In 1958, the neighborhood was new. Rows of modest one-story homes with neatly trimmed lawns, white picket fences, and children riding tricycles in the street. Eleanor was the youngest of 3, the quiet one with soft brown curls and a gaze older than her years. The Morris family had moved from Chicago in the spring, hoping for a quieter life in California after. A long winter and a difficult year. They weren't there long. Less than 3 months after arriving, Eleanor vanished on a warm afternoon while her mother hung laundry in the backyard. She had been playing alone in the front yard just beyond the gate, wearing her favorite blue dress with the white trim. One moment she was there, crouching near the flowers she had helped plant weeks before. The next, she was gone. The police combed the neighborhood. Flyers were posted, dogs were brought in. The local paper covered the story for weeks. Neighbors offered theories, prayers, and casseroles. But nothing was found. No witnesses, no items. Left behind, no signs of struggle. Just silence. Her parents aged overnight. Her siblings were pulled from school. The family withdrew, haunted by a mystery no one could answer. After a year of waiting, the Morris family moved out of the house on Mulberry Street. They left without telling many people, as if escaping the echo of a name that had become too painful to say. Over time, Eleanor's name faded from the newspaper, archives, replaced by newer stories. Her missing poster, once stapled to every utility pole within 5 miles, was taken down and replaced by garage sale signs. Her absence, sharp and unbearable at first, dulled into a forgotten corner of local memory. Generations passed. The neighbors who had known the Morris family grew old, then passed on. The house was sold again and again. No one remembered. The child with the wide eyes. Until now. When Rachel found the box, it was as if a door had cracked open, a door no one had touched for decades. She sat at the kitchen table late into the night, reading every clipped article, every note scrawled, in the margins. She couldn't understand why this box was in the attic, who had hidden it, or what they had hoped to do with it. She wondered who had gone through the trouble of collecting these pieces, preserving them, then tucking them away as if waiting for someone else to finish the story. In one envelope, she found a school certificate from Eleanor's kindergarten, folded with care. It bore her name in a childlike font, a paper now yellowed and brittle. Another envelope held a drawing, a stick figure family with a small girl holding a flower. Ellie was written in the corner in pencil. Rachel stared at the drawing for a long time. The idea of a child being forgotten, not just missing, but erased, was almost too much to bear. She tried to imagine what had happened. A stranger, driving by? A neighbor with dark secrets? A family member who knew too much? She couldn't sleep. The box sat on the table all night like a ghost. The next morning, Rachel visited the local library. She searched through the archives, scrolling. Microfilm reels with trembling fingers. Eleanor's story had been real. She had existed, and for a short time, the world had looked for her. But the world had also moved on. Rachel couldn't. Something about Eleanor had rooted itself in her mind. A forgotten girl who had once laughed in the very rooms she now walked through, who had vanished without a sound, and whose story had been sealed in a cardboard box for over 60 years. That night, Rachel stood by the window, looking out at the street. It was quiet. The same street Eleanor had played on. The same sky above. Only the people had changed. The house, it seemed, remembered. In a quiet suburb 2 states away, a woman named Claire Thompson sat at her kitchen table, scrolling through the results of a DNA test she had taken out of curiosity more than anything else. She was one of those people who found comfort in family, history, the kind who saved old postcards and knew the names of great-uncles others had long forgotten. When she ordered the kit, it was meant as a casual project, a weekend curiosity. She never expected her results to disrupt a silence buried for generations. The test came back like they always did, percentages, regions, a list of distant matches. Most names meant nothing to her, but one stood out. A match labeled close. Relative, potential half-sibling or cousin, blinked back at her with a name she'd never heard, Rachel Morris. Claire stared at the name. She knew the Morris surname from stories her grandmother had told, whispers of a branch of the family that had moved west in the 1950s and had disappeared from contact not long after. Something about that name unearthed a memory. Her grandmother had mentioned a child once, a little girl who had vanished. Eleanor, that was the name. Claire had thought it was a rumor, a sad family myth. But now the DNA test suggested there was still someone out there. Someone descended, from the same line. A line that had, at some point, split in ways no one had talked about. She reached out to Rachel through the testing site's messaging feature, hesitant but compelled. Rachel answered within hours. The connection startled them both. Rachel had never heard of Claire, and Claire didn't know Rachel existed. They compared notes, family names, towns, stories half remembered from elderly relatives who were no longer alive to fill in the blanks. Rachel mentioned the box. She described the photo of the girl, the school certificate, the missing posters, the articles folded with care. Claire listened silently, something stirring inside her. As a child, she remembered asking why her grandmother cried every year on June 3rd. She had always thought it was a private sorrow, something about a sibling or a lost love. No one had ever spoken of Eleanor in full. Now it made sense. The connection became more than just names and shared DNA. Together, Rachel and Claire began to reconstruct what had been lost. Not just the facts, but the feeling that Eleanor had been part of something bigger, something still alive. The DNA had done more than trace bloodlines. It had cracked open a vault that time had sealed shut. Claire dug through her own boxes, the ones she kept in her basement. She found a faded envelope with the return address of Mulberry Street, sent from her grandmother in 1959. Inside was a photo of a little girl with soft curls standing in a garden. The name on the back read simply, Ellie. Claire had never thought twice about it. Now she understood. The girl in the photo had a face too familiar to be forgotten. It wasn't just coincidence. It was blood speaking across generations, pulling pieces of a forgotten puzzle back together. The DNA had forced a reckoning, not just for Rachel and Claire, but for the idea that a child could disappear and be lost entirely. Eleanor had not vanished into dust. Her story had waited, quiet, patient, buried in boxes and bloodlines, until science and memory finally collided. Rachel couldn't stop thinking about the backyard. It had become a place of quiet obsession. Every time she looked out the kitchen window, her eyes drifted to the far corner where the grass never seemed to grow right. The rest of the yard was healthy, green, even thriving, but that one section remained dull and sunken, as if something beneath the surface had been pressing upward for decades. It was a small detail, easily ignored by most, but now, knowing what she did, Rachel couldn't dismiss it. She and Claire had spent weeks digging through the contents of the box, organizing everything by date, building a timeline of Eleanor's short life and sudden disappearance. Something had never sat right with Rachel about the way the case had been dropped so quickly. The original police notes hinted at suspicions, particularly toward Eleanor's father. There had been inconsistencies in his statements and signs of tension within the household, but no charges had ever been filed. The Morris family simply vanished from the narrative, slipping into obscurity, leaving only the unresolved grief behind. Claire's mother, now deep in the fog of dementia, had mumbled fragmented phrases during a recent visit, fragments that struck Rachel like puzzle pieces suddenly fitting together. She had mentioned a garden, a blue dress, and something about, "He told me to forget." The weight of those words echoed louder than any document. It wasn't enough for the authorities, but it was enough for Rachel. One morning, unable to hold back her impulse any longer, Rachel walked out to the backyard with a metal probe. She pushed it into the soft earth. In that quiet corner of the yard, the soil gave way too easily. Her heart pounded. She marked the U spot and called the police. The forensic team arrived 2 days later. They began a slow, careful excavation. At a depth of just under 3 feet, they uncovered fragments, what appeared to be cloth, aged and decomposed but still faintly blue. Further down, they found more. Small bones, weathered by time, and a rusted bracelet with the name Ellie, barely visible through oxidation. The yard was sealed off. News trucks arrived. The house that had once kept its silence now buzzed, with the sounds of reporters and investigators. DNA testing confirmed the worst. The remains were human, and preliminary analysis suggested they belonged to a child around 6 years old. Rachel stood behind the window as they carried the evidence. Out, wrapped gently, respectfully. Her hands trembled. For the first time since discovering the box, she cried. Later, a deeper search of the attic revealed a thin wooden panel in the back of the closet space, slightly warped. Behind it was another envelope, smaller than the others, yellowed and tied, with string. Inside were 2 letters written in a man's neat but uneven hand. The date was 1958. The letters weren't sent. They were addressed to MJ, and they revealed a harrowing confession. In them, Eleanor's father wrote about a terrible moment of rage, about a fall, about panic and shame. He spoke of hiding what had happened, of thinking he would come back later and fix it, of believing no one would look too hard. He never sent the letters. He never told anyone. He had simply buried the truth, in the soil, in silence, in the attic, and moved away. The letters ended abruptly. No signature, just a final line that read, "I never stopped hearing her voice." The evidence was undeniable. A case that had remained open for over 6 decades was no longer a mystery. It was now something heavier, a quiet horror left unresolved for a generation. But it was no longer hidden. Rachel stood by the fence one evening, watching as the sun dipped below the horizon. Claire had flown in again, and they sat together in silence near the place where Eleanor had been found. For so long, the truth had rested only inches beneath the grass. A secret buried in plain sight, waiting for someone to care enough to look down and listen. The letters were short, but they said everything. Folded tightly and discolored by time, they carried the kind of truth no one ever speaks aloud. Rachel sat at the kitchen table reading them again and again, tracing each word as though they might change if she looked long enough. They were dated, only weeks after Eleanor had disappeared, written in a restrained, almost formal tone. The man who wrote them, Eleanor's father, had used careful, deliberate language as if he were trying to make sense of something unspeakable. He never once said her name, but every line was saturated with guilt. There had been an argument, a moment of anger, a shove, a fall, and then stillness. He described panic, silence, and a world that seemed to close in around him. He had dug a hole in the backyard, late at night when no one could see, and placed his daughter there gently, as if that could make up for what had happened. He spoke of her blue dress, of brushing dirt from her cheek, of whispering an apology he would never repeat aloud. He told no one, not even his wife. He lived with it. Let the case be filed as missing. Let the neighbors believe what they wanted. Let the silence grow over the years like ivy on a wall. Rachel imagined the man living out his life with that secret, waking up each morning knowing that the house held her memory, that her room remained untouched for months, then years, until the family could no longer bear the weight. They moved away, leaving the past behind, but he carried it with him, inside letters he couldn't send, inside a heart that had severed its own ability to speak. He died in the 1970s, according to records Claire had uncovered. No one at the time suspected anything more than a heart attack. There had been no investigation, no curiosity. The past was buried, and everyone had moved on. But he hadn't. In the second letter, the words became more fragmented, more frantic. He mentioned hearing her voice in the night, dreaming of her standing by the door, silent, not accusing, just present. He feared the day someone would find out, but feared even more that no one ever would. He asked for forgiveness, but not from God. He didn't believe he deserved that. Instead, he asked it from anyone who ever cared to remember. It was not a confession meant for absolution. It was a record of a man destroyed by his own actions, too afraid to speak, too proud to fall apart in public. Rachel handed the letters over to the police, who included them in the reopened case file. They brought final clarity, but no further prosecution. He was long gone. No living person remained to bear legal consequence. Yet the truth had a way of echoing, even through the void he'd left behind. The local news ran a segment. A photo of Eleanor appeared on screen, accompanied by a quiet narration of what had been found. For the first time in decades, her name was spoken again. Her story, told not as a disappearance, but as a tragedy with a face, a house, and a voice behind it. Claire found a third letter later, folded into a book of poetry her grandmother had kept. It was unsigned, but the handwriting matched. It didn't mention Eleanor at all, but instead spoke in metaphors, of shadows in the soil, of windows that never closed, of voices caught in the cracks of wooden walls. It ended with a single line. She would have been 7 next week. Rachel thought about how many people had walked through that house, unaware of what had happened beneath their feet, how many dinners were eaten, how many birthdays celebrated, how silence could make space for 100 new stories while one stayed, hidden underneath them all. The truth didn't erase the horror, but it ended the silence. And in that ending, there was something like justice, something like peace. Eleanor Morris was laid to rest on a quiet morning in early spring. The sky above was pale, the kind of soft gray that muffled sound and made time feel slower. The town she had vanished from had changed in nearly every way. New streets, new faces, new homes. But on that day, the space around her memory became still. The remains were buried in a small corner of the local cemetery, beneath a new headstone carved simply, Eleanor B. Morris, 1952-1958, finally found, forever loved. No fanfare, no grand procession, just a handful of people who refused to let her vanish again. Rachel and Claire stood side by side, hands clasped, watching as the final shovelful of earth was placed over the tiny plot. There were no photos of Eleanor growing up, no teenage years, no adulthood. Only that one school portrait, folded so many times it nearly tore down the middle, now restored and framed in a soft wooden edge, placed near the grave. For decades, she had lived only in rumor, only in silence. But now, for the first time, her story had an ending. Bitter, quiet, but real. The town council quietly approved a plaque to be placed near the house, not naming names, but acknowledging that a missing child had once lived there and had finally been found. Some neighbors protested, not wanting the association. Others came forward with hazy recollections, elderly men and women who remembered the girl with the dress, or that one summer when the police came so often. Memory, once fragmented, began to stitch itself back together. Not all threads were reliable, but the fabric of Eleanor's presence grew more solid in the collective consciousness. Inside the house, Rachel and Ben kept the box, every article, every letter, every fragment of the case preserved in a fireproof case. It wasn't for curiosity anymore, it was a kind of testimony. Claire donated the bracelet to a small local exhibit being built to honor children who had gone missing and were never found. Eleanor's name, now listed among them, was marked with an asterisk and a note. Case closed. Body recovered, 2024. She had been one of the few who came home, even if home was only a place in the ground. The backyard, once the source of so much quiet dread, became a garden. Rachel planted wildflowers over the place where the earth had once caved. A bench was placed nearby, under the maple tree that had somehow survived since the 1950s. The tree's bark was cracked and heavy with age, but it stood. On warm evenings, Rachel would sit there and read aloud from books Eleanor might have liked, her voice soft in the wind. Not out of ritual, not out of guilt, but because the silence no longer belonged to Eleanor. It had been broken, and now there was room for a voice. News of the discovery faded from headlines after a few weeks. The internet moved on. But the story lingered where it mattered most. In the house, in the soil, in the people who had helped bring her back. Claire began working on a book. Not about true crime, not about violence, but about memory. How people disappear twice, first from the world, then from its memory, and how sometimes, through accidents and attics and unanswered questions, they return. Eleanor's presence was no longer just a story in a box or a whispered name. She had weight again, a name carved in stone, a place to bring flowers, a childhood acknowledged even if too late. Her photo sat on Rachel's mantel for months. Then, one day, without thinking too hard about it, Rachel placed the frame into a smaller wooden box and tucked it back into the attic, this time not to forget, but to keep. Not hidden, but protected. Eleanor had been lost. Now she was remembered, and in that remembering, something broken had been made whole.